What's going on, American History 2 students? This is Mr. Bell back with another lesson for you. Today we're going to be covering Unit 4, Section 2, so that's going to be 4.2 if you're following along in the PowerPoint that's on Canvas, and that is going to dive into what got America into the Great Depression. In other words, the causes of the Great Depression that will later set up Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. We're going to start out with a warm-up, go through section 4.2 in notes. If you have any questions about anything this week or anything in general regarding the class, don't be afraid to reach out to me at bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org. So this is day 138 of 180 if we were in school, so the days are ticking down, and this is day 13 of the COVID-19 shutdown, which is Wednesday, April 1st, 2020, April Fool's Day. So happy April Fool's Day. What was the first non-silent movie in America? It was called The Jazz Singer. Those were known as talkies. And all this stuff comes from 4.1. What was the name of the plane that Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic? It was the Spirit of St. Louis. 4. Who wrote A Farewell to Arms? What was it about? It was Ernest Hemingway, and it was about the meaningless of war, mainly referencing World War I. The people of the 1920s were known as the Lost Generation because they didn't have something like a war to define them, like the generation before them in World War I, or the Greatest Generation, the Depression, and all that after World War II. So let's go ahead and get into the lesson today. Before I do, I can review this warm-up like I would in class. The first one is The Jazz Singer. The second one is The Spirit of St. Louis. The last one is Ernest Hemingway, and it is about the meaningless of war. And the fourth one here, or the next to last one, I should have said the last one, is The Lost Generation. So let's go ahead and get into, see, my daughter's been messing with my computer here. Let's get into the section of notes, the Great Depression. There is part of the FDR Memorial in Washington, D.C. Cool little monument park they had there, a giant statue of FDR and his little terrier Fowler, and you have the famous, or I should say infamous, breadline statue in that park. Before we get into the Depression, we're going to cover some other stuff. A lot of people blame Herbert Hoover for the Depression because he was the one, there's a bug here. He was the one when things started to go bad who could not do anything to help America's pain during the Great Depression. But he is not the only president that led toward that. You had Warren Harding, you had Calvin Coolidge, and then, of course, Herbert Hoover. So 3 presidents really led us toward the Great Depression, with one pulling us out of it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, better known, of course, as FDR. So let's start with Warren Harding. We spoke about him in a previous section. A return to normalcy was his campaign slogan. He was tired of America fighting in these wars like the Spanish-American War and World War I, and he wanted to focus on the people in America, kind of get back to isolation, and mainly put the economy first. The Teapot Dome scandal is the scandal that defined his presidency. So what happened with the Teapot Dome scandal? The government has its own oil fields that are used for the military. The Teapot Dome oil field, which was in Wyoming, was a massive stockpile of oil that was used for the United States military. Well, come to find out, old Warren Harding was using the power of the presidency to enrich himself, and he was selling that government oil that was to be used for the military and paid for by taxpayers. He was selling it on the side to make a private profit. Congress started investigating. It looked like he was going toward impeachment. And then you had a guy come forward named Albert Fall, who said it was his idea. He instigated it. The president knew nothing about it, and Fall ended up going to jail. So the easy way to remember this is Albert Fall took the fall for the Teapot Dome scandal. We're going to move on to Calvin Coolidge. Keep cool with Coolidge. Now, all these presidents here are Republicans. You got Harding, Coolidge, Hoover. And Coolidge is the one who really implements laissez-faire economics, the French term, which means cut government regulations, cut taxes, cut government spending, let the private sector flourish as much as possible, and that will be good for the economy, a almost top-down approach. He's the first Republican to really do this. And he wants to focus on things like the stock market, things like the business world. The business of America is business. Keep cool with Coolidge. They did have some neat little campaign slogans. He was not that great of a president. Here's the problem with laissez-faire. If people can be trusted, laissez-faire works great because you have a truly free market system. But most people, as you know, cannot be trusted. So that's where if you have no government regulation to go along with a free market, this can sometimes lead to corruption, which can lead to financial hardship, which is exactly what happened with the Great Depression. When I'm talking about the Great Depression, we're talking unemployment up over 30%. We're talking no Social Security, no WIC, no food stamps, nothing like that to help these people out. It is the greatest financial hardship this country's ever faced. I think second, we may be about to face here with the results of the unemployment from the COVID-19 shutdown. So I was speaking with a history teacher who's a good friend of mine, Mr. Maney, out in Buncombe County, and he teaches same thing I did. We went to grad school together, and he was talking about how this generation wants to understand the Great Depression, because while it will not be as bad as that because we have government programs in place to prevent that suffering, it is the closest parallel we have to what's going to happen with the economy. And of course, we hope and pray that everybody can keep their job and feed their families. So laissez-faire is good in theory, and if people can be trusted, but when you put it into practice without regulation, it can lead to corruption, which is what happens here. The Haley-Smoot tariff was a huge tariff. A tariff, as you guys know, as I've said 100 times in class, is a tax on the import. This is fine in the early 1800s. I'm talking early 1800s, like 1800 to 1825. But as you have a more globalized economy in which you rely on trading with other parts of the world, China, England, Japan, South Korea, if you put tariffs on people, what are they going to do to you? Put tariffs on you. So your goods go to China, let's say with I'm just going to use some very vague numbers here. Don't take any of this for what it would be. Let's use a modern example of a tariff off of something you guys might be relatively familiar with, the PlayStation. The PlayStation made by Sony is made in Japan. That's where Sony's headquartered, and of course is shipped all over the world for to be sold. The PS5's getting ready to come out around this coming Christmas. So when a PS5 is sold in Japan, it's sold at a cheaper rate than it is in America, because when you ship the PS4 from Japan to America and America charges a import tariff on it, then to make the same amount of profit, they have to make up for that tariff, or they will be losing money. Sony would be by sending it into the United States. So let's just use American dollars. Let's say here the PS4 or PS5 costs $400, but the equivalent to American dollars it would cost in Japan would be $350, because you don't have that extra $50 to make up for the tariff. So the more tariffs you put on goods that you have sent to your country, the more tariffs that other countries will put on you. This, in essence, starts a trade war. And the Haley-Smoot tariff, which Coolidge backed, which originated from Congress, it wasn't like it was just his idea, was a big protective tariff that kind of stagnated the economy, because it made the price of all the goods that were being imported and sold from other countries and sold in the United States go up. Herbert Hoover. A lot of times you hear this to remember Hoover, because Hoover didn't do anything for World War I vets. Hoover didn't do anything for the Great Depression. There's the old Hoover vacuum cleaner, no connection here. But Herbert Hoover sucks like the Hoover vacuum cleaner does. Now, Herbert Hoover did visit Kings Mountain. To my knowledge, there's been 2 presidents that visited Kings Mountain. There was Herbert Hoover. He actually spoke at the battleground. There is a memorial over there to that speech. And George Bush 41, who came through on a train stop when he was running for president, either in 88 or 92, I can't remember. I think 92. My grandmother actually went to that. So Herbert Hoover is the president when the Depression begins. Coolidge and Harding pushes toward it, but it all catches up with the U.S. economy under Herbert Hoover. And he's to blame because he's a good man. Not a good president, but he's a good man. He's a very religious man, considers himself to be a strong Christian. And he believes that if Americans have a can-do attitude, they put their faith in God, that this all will take care of itself. So the problem is, it's too far gone. That simple faith without action is not going to solve America's problem. Besides the one not doing anything about the Great Depression, the bonus army defines his presidency. So the bonus army refers to World War I veterans who were denied their retirement. The U.S. military is paid via taxes. In fact, most of your tax money goes to pay for the military back then and today. So when the Depression happened and so many people lost their job, if you're not working, they're not taking income taxes out of your check, so the government has less tax money. So they have to cut certain things. Well, one of the things that Hoover cut was the retirement for the World War I veterans. They, furious because they gave some of them gave their bodies, saw friends give their lives for this country, and not getting their retirement, they were furious. They marched on Washington, and they demanded, this is kind of a protest, they demanded that they be given their retirement. Now, they weren't going to go in and take the money from the Treasury Department or something, but they thought this would send a big enough message. And this kind of got unruly, and they marched to the White House. And Herbert Hoover refused to come out to say anything to these World War I vets. Now, this was a dangerous situation, so you got to keep that in mind. But his Secret Service would later reveal he basically got under the Resolute desk in the Oval Office and started crying because he felt so bad and didn't know what to do. So America was looking for new leadership because Hoover and the Republican Party of that time had steered them in the wrong direction. That's where you get to Franklin Roosevelt. His presidency is defined by two things: leading America to victory in World War II, although he doesn't see its completion because he dies of polio, being elected 4 times as part of that, and pulling America out of the Great Depression. He's the only president to have been elected 4 times, but we're going to talk more about him down the road. So he comes up with a series of economic plans to get America out of the Depression, but before he kind of dives into the nitty-gritty of that and gives it a naming, gives the naming systems to all the programs, he puts it simply for the American people in 3 R's: relief, recovery, reform. And we'll get back to FDR. So here we're going to dive into a little more of why America got into the Great Depression and why the stock market crashed. So bear with me, take a quick break. Okay, one of the problems was automation, or as it used to be called, mechanization. Machines began to do jobs that people did. So instead of having somebody running and whipping a horse to plow a field, as you see on the image in the PowerPoint here, you had tractors that could do the work of 5 or 6 horses. So automation became a big thing. Now, it's more of a problem today than it was back then, but since this was our very first bout with automation, it kind of shocked the economic system in the United States. The other is overproduction. There was such a demand for goods in the 1920s that when things start going bad and people start to spend less money, people start to spend less money, there is a surplus of goods. So you have stores who have too much product. So they have to do a few things to get rid of this product. They have to lower the sell price, which lowers the profits. Lower the profits means that the companies can't pay workers, and this leads to, as you see on the PowerPoint, layoffs. Think about it when you go into Walmart or you go into the grocery store or Best Buy and they have a discount section. These items were not sold when they were at full price because there just wasn't a big enough demand for them. That's the way it was during the Great Depression for a majority of items, because people had overbought in the 1920s in big parts because of credit and advertising, which we'll talk about here in a second. And overproduction was a big problem. It caused little demand for product. A lot of times when there is a scarcity of product, the more valuable that product becomes. See toilet paper during the COVID-19 crisis. The more of a product there is, the less valuable. Well, at one point, people were buying, 10,000 GE washers and dryers a year. But as time passed and the economy started to slow down, they were buying 8,000 GE washer and dryers a year. So you have a surplus of 2,000 washers or dryers. They paid people to make those washers and dryers. The parts for those washers and dryers cost the company money, and they had to get rid of them. So what they do is they sell them at a discounted price, which makes loss for the company. And the less a company makes, the less it can afford to pay employees, which means they're going to start laying people off. So that's kind of the worker side of the Depression, and we'll kind of get back to that. But let's go to the stock market side. Now, I'm not a stock market expert here. By no means, I'm not your, brokerage advisor, but I do understand the basics of it. So this is something that I think is really easier to explain in person, but I'm going to try to take my shot at it. So stockbrokers encourage people to buy stock in company based on how well they think the company will do in the near or long-term future. So if a stockbroker thinks that all of a sudden next year there's maybe going to be a more demand for an iPhone, then he may encourage his, I'm trying to think of the word here. He may encourage his client, that's the word I'm trying to think of, to buy Apple stock. So you have stockbrokers, a good stockbroker does his research, does the market research, and he tells and encourages his client to invest in certain things that will then make him money. It will make the person investing money, and it will make the broker money because he will get a certain percentage of that product. Now, what happened in the lead up to the Great Depression was speculation by stockbrokers. They wanted to make more money, so they encourage people to make bad investments, because while they got a percentage of a profit if a stock did well, they also made a flat rate percentage based on each stock that they sold. So they were telling people that stocks in certain companies were going to go up when they had no basis for this, and people trusted them, and they made money, but the people who invested the money lost money. And so here you have the richer people who own stocks in the United States being hit hard with this type of stuff, and the average person being hit hard with automation, mechanization, as it was called back then, and overproduction. Buying on the margin was a problem. Now, since the Great Depression, a lot of these things would not be possible today, although a lot of these regulations, depending on the president, have been cut. The rules on the stock market are not as strict under Donald Trump as they were with Barack Obama. It's just a cyclical thing when you talk about Republicans and Democrats. I'm not saying one's right or one's wrong. I'm just telling you how it is. So buying on a margin. This is when you borrow money from a stockbroker to buy a stock with hopes to pay a profit to pay back the broker. The broker can make a margin call for their money to be repaid. So let me explain what that means. I kind of just read the slide there. But you have a stockbroker who wants his client to buy a stock, and the client may not have the money to buy the stock, so the stockbroker will loan the buyer, the client, some money, and they have to pay back that money with interest. It's almost like a loan or a credit card. Now, if the stock does well, they're going to have more than enough money to pay the stockbroker back with interest. So how might this work? Let me try to give you like an example here, a real life scenario of a margin call. And this goes hand in hand with speculation, because speculation was used as a means to do a margin call. Let's take a stock of something like Coca-Cola. You may have someone who wants to invest in Coca-Cola. And maybe their stockbroker is speculating that Coke is going to open new plants next year, so that stock price is going to go up, so there's a good chance for profit. But that's all speculation. He doesn't have any cold hard facts to back that up. So somebody wants to buy $500 worth of Coke stocks, but they don't have the money. So what the stockbroker will do is loan the $500 to the person to buy the stock. And once that stock shoots up, the stockbroker will make money off the stock and a flat rate fee. There was a problem though, because at this time you could do what was called a margin call. In other words, the person who was loaning the money, the stockbroker, could demand at any time for his money to be paid back plus interest. So let's say I as a stockbroker, loan Joey $500 to buy Coca-Cola stock. Okay, he buys that Coca-Cola stock, and all of a sudden that stock goes, it drops. I can a month later say, okay, I want my money back plus interest, and he's lost money. So it becomes a debt problem at that point. Let's kind of get back to how it affected the more average person here. Credit cards. Credit cards became a brand new thing in the 1910s and 1920s. In fact, a lot of people didn't really understand what credit cards were. Credit cards work in this way. They are all determined by interest rate. And that interest rate is determined on your credit history and how much money you may make within a given year. And most of the time when you start out with a credit card, these interest rates are going to be very high. So what ended up happening is there was a demand for products like washers, dryers, refrigerators, freezers, that type of thing. In the 20s, there was a lot of celebrity endorsements of these type of things that encouraged people who maybe couldn't afford them. It's not that they were poor, but they just couldn't outright afford to buy a brand new washer and dryer from Sears and Roebuck. It encouraged them to really want this item. So since they couldn't pay for it, their option was a credit card. And credit cards were a brand new thing, so they weren't understood back then like they were today. So your average family would open up a credit card account, buy a $750 washer and dryer set, and then they would say, all right, you're going to pay, $50 a month on this till you get it paid off. What they don't tell them is each month interest was accruing, sometimes at a very high rate. So you were paying a lot more than $50 a month back. You were paying in some cases, 20 to 32% interest. So you were paying, let me do that math. If you thought you were paying $50 a month, iPhone calculator here. So we got 50, let's do a 23% interest rate. That's $11.50 a month. So if it was a total of $750 times 0.23, that would be an extra $172. So you buy a $750 washer and dryer, and you're actually paying an extra $172 for it. And what happened a lot of times is, it's not that people couldn't afford to pay this back. They could. It was just a shock how much the interest was affecting how much they were going to have to pay back. And most people, guess what they did? They paid this back. But they didn't buy anything else once they realized kind of how credit worked. They're like, okay, I'm going to pay this washer and dryer back, but I'm not getting anything else on a credit card. And instead of going out to eat, instead of going to the movies, instead of going to a play, instead of going to buy a new car, since they were trying to pay back that money that they owed on the credit card, they just didn't go out. And this had a big negative impact on the economy. We talked about the Haley-Smoot tariff already. It created a higher price of imported goods and started a trading war with Europe. There was a big, a wealth gap, the unequal distribution of wealth, in which before everything kind of crashed, the rich were getting really rich and the poor were getting poorer. The in between, the middle class was shrinking, and anytime you face economic hardship, there's a light shown on this, that the rich do well, the poor do really bad, and everybody in the middle is just kind of left to languish, if you will. But it was a few people, these millionaires and billionaires, who owned a majority of the nation's wealth. So think about that. You had about 20 millionaires and billionaires in the United States who owned 50% of the nation's money. The other 50% of the money that was out there in circulation was left for the rest of us. And that created an economic disparity in the United States. Socioeconomic disparity. Too much deregulation. So Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, they cut regulations on the stock market, on trading and things of that nature. They cut regulations on banks. Banks were allowed to make bad investments with people's money. More on that later. And that all eventually caught up to the American people. And it all comes to a head on Black Tuesday, which is the day that the stock market crashed. Over $3 billion was lost on October 29th, 1929. This triggers the Great Depression. Now, not the majority of Americans don't own stocks. So it started to affect the average American more when it came to the banks than it did the stocks. I want you to pay attention to this part right here. It led to bank runs. When you take money that you work hard for, let's say you earn $500 by working at Taco Bell for a month, and you want to put that in your savings account. You put that in your savings account, and let's say you have a Wells Fargo banking account. You go to Wells Fargo. When you put that $500 in your savings account, Wells Fargo takes that money, they invest it, and then they make a profit off of your money. And if that money is lost, if they make a bad investment, then the government reimburses them for your money. So no matter what, you get your $500 out of the bank whenever you want to. It's not going to be lost. We didn't have that insurance by the government on people's savings before the Great Depression. So a few banks, not many, about 4 or 5 major banks made bad investments with people's money. And they made bad stock investments. So when the stock market crashed, these banks lost all these people's life savings. And people go to the banks to get their money out, and they're like, I'm sorry, we lost it. And we're talking $3 billion in loss here. We're not talking a couple tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it was because the banks had made bad investments due to speculation and margin calls and things of that nature. But this was only really 4 or 5 banks. So what caused the problem? What caused the major problem and what we call bank runs during the Great Depression is people began to panic. They thought, oh, those 4 or 5 banks made bad investments with their money. I bet my bank's going to do the same thing. So what did everybody do? They went to the banks, took all their money out, and started to put the money under their mattress, bury it in the backyard, that kind of thing. So all of a sudden, the banks had no money to invest with, and then the banks collapsed. This became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because people thought the banks would collapse, the banks did collapse. It's almost like you going to take a test, you studied for the test, you know the material, but for whatever reason you're having a bad day and you're like, I'm going to fail this test, I'm going to fail this test. Then what happens? You fail the test, even though you know the material. People are like, oh, these banks are going to fail. Look what happened to X, Y, and Z bank. What if that happens to my bank? And they all went and pulled their money out. And then, boom, the banking industry collapsed. So here you have a perfect storm of things. The stock market collapses. 4 or 5 banks collapse as a result. But because of those 4 or 5 banks collapsing, everybody pulls their money out. And then the rest of the banks collapse. Add on top that there is no social safety net, meaning things to help people when they lose their job, like unemployment checks, food stamps, WIC, and you have a recipe for disaster, and you have what is known as the Great Depression. We talked about this during the Hooverville activity yesterday. People lost their homes because banks, they needed some way to hold collateral over people, and a lot of that was done through mortgage foreclosures. So people would lose their homes, they would build these shacks, they were nicknamed Hoovervilles after Herbert Hoover. The government would feed people, especially in bigger cities, soup and bread, but sometimes you had people waiting in line for days, sometimes up to a week, trying to get soup our bread for their families. I'm not getting too much into Hoovervilles because we did a whole reading activity. It's a big deal. I'm not trying to dismiss it here, but I think 22 minutes on it yesterday was enough. So, beyond that, in the Midwest, you have a terrible, terrible drought. So all of a sudden, the agriculture industry, farming industry collapses as well. And many farmers in the Midwest, in places like Oklahoma, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, Idaho, places like that, they leave those places and then they go to the Northeast and West Coast looking for work. Well, guess what? There's no work to be had because of the Great Depression. So you have what's known as the Dust Bowl, or the Dirty 30s, out there. And now you also have a shortage of produce and things of that nature, especially corn coming out of Nebraska. So that's going to do it. Next time, we will get into 4.3. That'll be next week. We talk about the New Deal, which is FDR's plan to get America out of the Great Depression. I hope you guys have been enjoying these video lessons. I know you can't get out of this what you would in class, but I hope you're getting something out of it. If you have any questions, make sure you email me at bsbell@clevelandcountyschools.org. Thank you so much for watching, and stay safe.